Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Anti-Doping Podcast, brought to you by the Partnership for Clean Competition. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and today we are joined by our guest, Kim Ravn. Listeners, Kim is Chief Executive Officer at Anti-Doping Denmark, and today we are going to talk more about his career, the great work that they are doing at Anti-Doping Denmark, and the organization's commitment to clean sport and supporting anti-doping science. So, Kim, welcome to the show today. How are you?
Good. Thank you so much, Marie. I'm very good. Thanks.
Well, we are so excited to have you with us today. And I'd love to start by hearing a little bit more about your role and your responsibilities there at Anti-Doping Denmark, if you can tell us more.
Yep, of course, no worries. Well, as you just mentioned, Marie, I'm the CEO of the Danish National Anti-Doping Organization. So my task is to lead our programs and support our staff in their endeavors to promote and protect clean sport. And that's both organized sport in particular, but also in Denmark, we work with the whole fitness sector where we engage with gyms in order to prevent the use of doping in training environments as well. So I do all this in close cooperation with the Anti-Doping Denmark Deputy Director and with our board, of course, as well.
Phenomenal. And to rewind back to the beginning here, I know a lot of people have interesting stories about how they ended up in the field of anti-doping. So I'd love to hear your story, Kim. How did you first get interested in this area?
Yeah, well, how much time do we have? It's a long story. I'll try to do it short. I love sport. I love to play it. I love to watch it, to read about it and digest it in any possible way, I guess. Unfortunately, the Danish national football coach hasn't called me yet to ask for my services. So I'm humble and happy to be able to work with sport professionally in a different way, even though it's behind the desk rather than in shorts and on the pitch. But with the love of sport also comes an awareness of all the darker sides, such as, for example, doping. And since I grew up in the 80s and 90s, I loved cycling as well. And this was a period where Danish bike riders did really well, but also a time that led to reveal huge doping scams, not only by Danish bike riders, but internationally or globally, I should say. So that whole period of time probably displayed the perspectives on sport relating to values and fairness. And I've always had a well-developed interest in the rights and wrongs, not only in sport, but in society at large. So probably without knowing back then, it kind of initiated my interest in both sport, but also all the other parts of sport, sticking to the rules and so on.
Absolutely. Sort of the behind the scenes parts of sport. So Can you tell us then, once this interest started in you, how did you find your way to your current position? What is the path that you took?
Well, it's probably a combination of a lot of things and some coincidences as well, as I guess a lot of working careers play out. I used to coach my kids in the local football club, or I should probably say soccer club in this context. And then at some stage, coaching my kids, I was asked to go on the board in this club, rather large, an amateur club, but still a rather large club, and ended up accepting that and ended up actually as a chairman of the board for some years of this football club. So I got to spend time working with both management and leadership and the whole political side of sport, in this case, football. Besides that, I was educating myself within political science and had obviously a great interest of management and leadership. Worked for some years in different positions in political organizations. And then at some stage, this opportunity to join Anti-Doping Denmark arose. And I saw that as a way to combine my lifelong passion for sport with my great interest in both management and leadership and politics and society and value-driven work, I would say. So that was what brought me to Anti-Doping Denmark and kept me here for more than 10 years now with holding different positions in Anti-Doping Denmark, first as an executive assistant to the CEO of Anti-Doping Denmark at the time. I think I was in that position for 3 or 4 years, and then some years as head of secretariat, another 4 years as deputy director, and going on my second year as a chief executive officer now. So that's kind of the short story, I guess.
Absolutely. I know the time goes by quickly when you're having fun. Like you said, you've been there
That's right.
over 10 years now, which I think is remarkable. So, Kim, from your perspective, how has Anti-Doping Denmark changed as an organization, or perhaps the clean sport landscape as a whole changed in Denmark over the time?
Yeah, well, a lot of things, thinking back, has changed, I guess. I think the test regime, the test system of today is a lot more sophisticated than when I originally joined the community. It was already really advanced back then, but science, as you guys are heavily involved in as well, has really contributed to developing the doping control efforts remarkably over the last decade. Also important to mention, there's even more focus on education nowadays. The dedicated education standard as well, coming into force some years ago. So that's really important development as well. And I would say also even greater reliance on intelligence and investigations. And among this also collaboration with other stakeholders, for example, public authorities, law enforcement, and so on. So that's a way to work with the whole anti-doping field from a lot of different angles, with both doping control, education, and intelligence, and a way for these different disciplines to contribute to one another. So that's probably some of the highlights from a Danish perspective. I said also there's been some important developments on increasing the independence and good governance of our work. There's been some changes to how we are structured and so on. So that's some important developments. And probably I should say also, not only in Denmark, but internationally in the community at large, there's an even more athlete-centered approach to anti-doping in order to develop athlete-friendly anti-doping efforts, realizing and acknowledging that anti-doping is all about the athletes, and they're the ones experiencing anti-doping on their bodies and lives. So we are obliged to try to develop less intrusive methods and systems as possible. And I think that's a really important development we've seen the last several years, and one that should continue for the coming years as well.
Absolutely. I agree that this shift towards maybe a more athlete-centric view has been definitely a positive change among the ones that you mentioned as well. And I'd love to dive into, you mentioned in our earlier part of our conversation in talking about your roles that Anti-Doping Denmark, of course, covers both elite athletes, but you also work with gyms, fitness centers, and just in general maintaining public health. So can you tell us more about the broad scope of the services that you provide and the people that you serve there?
Yes, indeed, Marie. We work with the gyms and training environments in order to improve public health, as you mentioned. The reasons for working in sport is fairness and competition. The reasons for working in the gyms and this sector is the public health-driven effort. We cooperate with the sector. So we cooperate with the gyms, with the fitness centers, in order to collaborate on creating safe and healthy training environments, clean and free from doping. It's a preventive measure. So we have fitness consultants. You could compare them to DCOs, doping control officers, but they are preventive at most. So they visit all these gyms. They have dialogue with staff, but especially also with members. There's a lot of young members. Working out in gyms is the largest, by far largest sport or physical activity in Denmark, all the way down to people only at the age of 13.
Oh, wow.
So we put a great deal of effort into speaking to all these young people about how to work out and how you can reach really good training results without having to use doping. We try not to have like scaring tactics or scaring campaigns telling them how unhealthy it is to use doping and how dangerous it is to your health and to your body, even though we're realizing that it is really unhealthy. But that's our way of working. And we do also perform doping control in these environments, but also as a preventive measure in order to protect the environment and to protect the people in these gyms that has chosen to cooperate with us. And then we remove the, so to speak, negative role models who could potentially inspire other members, including all the young ones I mentioned before, to possibly dope. So that's the way we work in those areas.
I think this is very cool and something that's relatively unique to Anti-Doping Denmark. And I guess thinking about the balance, managing the programs for all of the elite athletes is quite a big task. How do you balance that in addition to this kind of more public health focused initiative in gyms?
Yeah, well, that's always a balance, as you mentioned. It's been a big political wish from Danish politicians from many years ago. We've done this for close to 15 years, I think. So it's a task that we both ourselves think is very important, but also that we by law obliged to perform. So it's always the task we look at with just as much seriousness as we do with athletes in elite sport. Of course, it's two different worlds. It's different. Sometimes there's an overlap in the target groups. That's another good reason for doing it, because a lot of elite level athletes, they train and work out in public gyms as well. But it has its own legitimate reason for being dealt with that area as well.
Very interesting. And in your earlier response about some of the changes that you've seen over time, you mentioned this sort of increased collaboration across a variety of stakeholders. And I think this collaborative nature is one of the things that makes anti-doping really exciting and rewarding. So can you talk about how Anti-Doping Denmark collaborates or interacts with a wide variety of stakeholders there in the global anti-doping community, whether it's the PCC WADA, the Danish police, or others?
For sure. For example, with the PCC, we see the PCC as a really strong and well-funded research capacity with an innovative mindset in order to support the anti-doping community. And to support in the concrete context in Denmark, we've experienced really good support for Danish research institutions and especially also for upcoming researchers through the fellowship programs. Realizing that the Anti-Doping Denmark's research funds are limited, additional funding from the PCC has been really good help in order to develop important research results in a Danish context and in a lot of instances with relevance for international scope as well. So we see the PCC as a central hub for applied anti-doping research. And also we benefit greatly from participating in the PCC conferences, which is of great value to us. Always new and updated knowledge and relevant stakeholders to have good dialogues with. So that's for the PCC. But as you mentioned, we also cooperate with a great variety of stakeholders. And just to mention a few, on the law enforcement side, we have good dialogue with the Danish police. They have a jurisdiction that we don't have when we're talking about breaking not only sport rules, but breaking law. So they can be a valuable partner in doping cases. For example, importing doping to Denmark, which is one of the things that makes it possible for both elite athletes, but also people in gyms to get doping, to buy doping. So we talk to them about that. They sometimes reach out to us in order to understand what kind of doping substances it is they've seized. And that could be from customs as well. There was a Grand Depart, Tour de France took off from Denmark some years ago. We had good dialogue with both police and customs back then. And we actually teach about doping substances every other year at the police officer education as well, in order to both increase the knowledge, but also the interest of the whole anti-doping field at an important stakeholder like the police. Because it is, of course, like in anti-doping, there's a lot of priorities to be made. Same thing as, for example, the police. So we always try to remind them of the relevance of looking into our field as well, as we think it's extremely important. I should say also in relation to the dialogue with customs, we have a really good cooperation in order of the Danish customs providing a list of people who have tried to import doping substances to Denmark, but have been stopped. And that has led to some cases where we can discover people from sport as well who tried to import these banned substances. And also, for example, in the Tour de France example I mentioned before, when people were entering the country, they were able to contribute to anti-doping measures as well, stopping people at Danish borders and so on. So that's just a few examples on how we can, as an anti-doping organization, succeed without having great cooperation with a lot of other skilled stakeholders.
Definitely. I think these partnerships are critical to the success of anti-doping. And, thinking about what Anti-Doping Denmark does particularly well, you mentioned, of course, these partnerships, and I think this engagement with public health as a whole. Are there any other things that really stand out in your mind, Kim, that makes Anti-Doping Denmark unique or that are particular strengths?
Thinking about the uniqueness of some of the things we do, probably some other countries work with, amongst others, our Norwegian colleagues work with the fitness area, the gyms as well, in a slightly different way than we do. So probably we are among a few NATO's, national anti-doping organizations, I should say, who cover a greater proportion or more people in the doping landscape than the more narrow scope on the organized sport with our work in the gyms. We also have a status as a public authority, so we can engage in collaborative efforts and share data with other public authorities in a probably easier way than some other anti-doping organizations. We try to always, I don't know if that's unique, but that's something that I think we do okay well. We try to not be afraid to make experiments, to take on projects and try new things. Some succeed, some don't, but to try to continually improve our efforts in both the organized sport and in the gyms as well. And working with dried blood spot, we can get back to that probably, but working with new test methods is one example of that, supported by the PCC as well. And one of our core values is curiosity. So we're always looking for ways to improve our work. So that, I would say that would be some of the things to highlight. Maybe also we've put a whole lot of focus into integrating the different disciplines. So for example, integrating the intelligence and investigations work with the testing department work, and to target our testing work, but actually also to target our educational efforts. So this close cooperation across the different disciplines is something that I think we do okay well as well.
I think that's wonderful. I think when everything's split up into silos and those different portions of the anti-doping system aren't talking to each other, you run into a lot of problems. So
yeah, exactly.
So you mentioned that you have sort of experimented or explored new projects and different things. What are some of, you think, the coolest or most interesting projects or experiments that you've tried?
Well, I should probably mention what I just briefly touched upon before, being part of developing this test method with the dry blood spot. This new, I know you've had on your podcast people from TASO as well discussing this test method, but this way of developing ability to collect blood samples and make it easier, quicker, less intrusive for athletes and so on, and contributing to both athletes' experience of the anti-doping work, but also to the anti-doping organization's efficiency and so on. That's been one of the really good developments that we've been part of recent years, I would say.
I think that's wonderful. And I think celebrating these successes in anti-doping is important because there are a lot of challenges and a lot of new things coming up all the time that you have to deal with. So, Kim, when you look at sort of the scene right now, what do you see as the biggest challenges that Anti-Doping Denmark is currently facing?
A few things pop into my mind. We for sure need to, or we want to become even better in using the great amount of data we're already sitting on. We have a whole lot of data or access to a whole lot of data, and also become even more qualified at using or developing relevant data or including data from other sources in our work. For this reason, last year, just around a year ago, we hired a data analyst to help us qualify the work in this area across all our work in the organization. So across testing, across education, across the I&I work. So this is one of the challenges where we see we can move our work in a positive direction. Another area to mention could be performance of IT systems across the community, integration between those systems, improving the efficiency in that area of work would be a great success if that could become even better. And also on a more broad level, the whole efficiency of the anti-doping work, both to become know more about the efficiency and on top of that, improve the efficiency.
Absolutely. And I'd love to dig into this data aspect that you mentioned. What kinds of data is Anti-Doping Denmark currently collecting, or do you currently have access to?
Well, it's anti-doping related data, of course. So it will be probably a lot of the same data that our colleagues would have access to. So in that sense, it's probably not unique. So it's more a matter of being able to detect patterns among the different set of data. For example, being sufficiently unpredictable in our way of rocking up for doping controls. So we make sure that you can't foresee when our doping control missions are placed. That could be one example. So it's really just a matter of harvesting all the relevant data within our systems already from the work we already do and to use it in different ways, I would say.
Very cool. So kind of extracting the information you need and making strategic plans off of it, it sounds like. I think that's a really important element of anti-doping. So we mentioned anti-doping research, of course, and the importance of data. Can you comment on why you see it as so valuable or so important for Anti-Doping Denmark to be engaged and to support anti-doping research?
It's been one of our strategic priorities. It is and always has been. And it is because if we don't continually develop the knowledge, we were going to be lacking behind. We want to make sure that we develop the highest and most qualified knowledge in order to improve our efforts, and ensuring that the developed knowledge, it is also applied in the anti-doping work to be able to make that actual transition from new knowledge to new practice. So we're very focused on that. And also probably acknowledging that even though anti-doping work's been around for a while, it's still a relatively new field compared to a lot of other areas. WADA was only established 25 years ago. Anti-Doping Denmark, within the next year's time, celebrates its 20th anniversary. So even though anti-doping has come a long way, we still have a whole lot of land to win on both our ways of working and collaborating and so on. And I think research plays an extremely important role in these endeavors. There's, of course, always also new technologies from other areas, from bigger businesses that can be used and applied in anti-doping work. Research plays an important role in that regard. And also in Denmark, I think we have good resources in the universities and they perform high-level research, and it would be a bad thing not to make use of that.
Certainly. And I'm so glad to hear that anti-doping research and science has been sort of integrated into the priorities of the organization for quite a while now. So let's talk about the different ways that Anti-Doping Denmark is advancing anti-doping science. So what are some of the key scientific priorities at the moment, or the key initiatives that you're working on in this area?
Well, we do have a research committee with people from both the organization, from the secretariat, from the board, but also with external partners in the research committee. So we try to cover all aspects of both social science research and the other natural science research, the wet sciences as well. Mm-hmm. We have an annual budget for research where we give science grants, people who can ask for these within sometimes prioritized areas and other times with just open grants where you can apply for a relevant project within the anti-doping field. Some of the areas we've been particularly interested in recently has been the prevalence. I touched upon this earlier in our conversation, but the prevalence of doping in both sport, but also in fitness in the gyms. We do have some data on this, but we could make good use of newer and more updated and even better data in this area in order to be even more clear on how many do actually dope. So that's one area. We're looking into developing the biological passport. Right now, we collaborate with USADA, the U.S. anti-doping agency, around testing the collection of capillary blood with the TASO device. We've been looking into side effects of steroids, our efforts working in the gyms in that whole area. We've got a pretty unique outset for this since in Denmark we have really good registers, but also we've had a whole lot of sanctioned athletes testing positive for a lot of the time steroids in the gyms. So combining these two things have provided some really unique studies on the side effect of steroids in a whole lot of different ways. And also we're looking into treatment of the side effect of the use of anabolic steroids and talking to the health system in different ways about how to solve this problem. So those are some of the focus areas. And then, of course, as I mentioned before, which is a really big thing for us, the whole dry blood spot test method has been a really important thing. Sarah Solheim started working on a PhD here in anti-doping Denmark, supported by the PCC. And that test method has been an integrated part of our doping control program. We've had a handful of cases so far, and up until the last official anti-doping statistics from WADA, which was from 2022. None of the 23 ones have been publicized yet. I don't think so. Mm-hmm. But back from 2022, I think there hasn't been actually too many, a handful of anti-doping organizations maybe working with the dry blood spot method. And I think actually Anti-Doping Denmark was at the time the only organization who had a positive test from this method. So it's still early days with this method and it's still being developed, but it's a really important one. And we have had, as I mentioned, up until now, a handful of cases. We've had some more cases last year. And the really important thing about this method is that we've done some study as well that shows that athletes prefer this test method over alternative test methods. They find it less intrusive or less painful or smoother and faster. So they just prefer this, which is, I think, is a really important finding. And also we've dedicated funds to developing the detection possibilities with this method even further. So those would be some of the focus areas of our anti-doping science within the last couple of years and the years to come.
Very cool. And I think, like you mentioned, this dried blood spot testing, it's a tremendously promising technology that's being developed and starting to be implemented. And you mentioned, of course, Dr. Sarah Solheim, who has worked previously at Anti-Doping Denmark during her PhD program. And the PCC is excited to be providing support for Sarah as part of our PCC fellowship program. So can you maybe comment on the value of these kinds of training programs for early career scientists?
As I said before, I think they're extremely important. We've benefited greatly from having Sarah and from the work she's done. We think it's important to keep talented researchers within the anti-doping field. As I mentioned before, it still is a relatively new field and it's also a relatively small field. So when we have skilled people around, I think it's such an important initiative to support the people who want to work in this field and to keep skills sticking around. So I think the PCC program is in this regard pretty unique. And we will also, the whole research area and trying to stimulate interest and develop talents, we will try to introduce and raise awareness about anti-doping work and research through a student award program in order to increase and raise interest among students at the universities to find interest in the anti-doping field. as a NATO, as a national anti-doping organization from a small country, we still have the ambition to aim higher and to improve not only our own work, but to try to contribute to the community at large. So this is a really important priority to us.
I couldn't agree more. And I think a lot of the people I talk to who are currently anti-doping scientists, this was not their original plan. So I think introducing early career scientists, whether it's during their college, graduate school, or postdoctoral stages, to the idea that this is a field that they can go into and is, of course, a really exciting field. Not that we're biased, but
yeah, no doubt. And I should probably also say, when you asked about this and Sarah's role working with us and how we benefited from that, a very concrete development from Sarah being here is that we've developed the DBS method to apply that in our work in the gyms as well. So from this year, from 1st of January this year, 2024, we've implemented the DBS method as the method in the gyms. It's a great improvement of our work out there as we see it. It makes the situation for when we perform tests in the gyms a lot easier, a lot smoother. It's a different environment to work in, usually a very good and friendly environment, but sometimes also with target groups who haven't sort of signed up for the anti-doping work in the same dedicated way as people in organized sport. So whatever can improve the smoothness of the procedure is also a good thing. So this is a huge improvement of our work in this area.
Absolutely. I can imagine people who are just kind of popping by the gym at the end of a busy day at work are not looking forward to a blood draw, the sort of the full procedure.
Yeah. I should say also that we work very targeted in these environments. So I think it's above 50% of the people we call out for a test that come out either positive or that they choose not to cooperate or to be part of it, which introduces a sanction to them as well. So we are very targeted on using this. And also, I should say, when we visit gyms, it's only 1 out of 10 visits or something like that results in us actually calling someone out for doping control. Most of the time, we don't meet people that we find relevant. And when we do, of course, we invite them to this test. But a lot of the time, we talk to the young people everyone working up there and to the staff as well.
Excellent. I think this sounds like a brilliant approach. And I know, going back to the research vein, Anti-Doping Denmark is also working with support of the Novo Nordisk Foundation to complete important research to raise awareness of the harmful effects of doping. And I think this is an important area for just kind of general public health and awareness. So can you talk a little bit more about this collaboration with Novo Nordisk Foundation and the research that you're working on?
Yeah, so the Novo Nordisk Foundation supported some of the large hospitals in Denmark and some of the scientists working there as well. And they are some of the same scientists that we've had a close cooperation during the years and who science and research we've supported as well. So we're happy to see that the Novo Nordisk Foundation is supporting these endeavors as well in this extremely important area. And it's a good example of having other stakeholders backing the anti-doping field up. Because as we discussed earlier in our conversation, Marie, we as anti-doping organizations for sure can't succeed with protecting sport and keeping it clean on our own. So these are really important contributions from stakeholders like the Novo Nordisk Foundation.
Absolutely. And you very recently, earlier this year, participated in the Play the Game conference that was held in Trondheim, Norway. You were among the presenters there. And I think these conferences are a really important venue to just bring stakeholders together from all over the world and from different sectors. So can you share some of your highlights from the meeting or key takeaways from the conference?
Yeah, for sure. The Play the Game conferences are an important conference to Anti-Doping Denmark. We always take part in it and we support it financially as well. We think it's really important. And between the conferences as well, they do brilliant work. And they deal with I think the way they put it themselves, the good people that play the game, that they deal with the homeless questions in sport. So they deal with some of the darker sides of sport, and they do it in a really good way in the matter of them being able to bring together practitioners like anti-doping practitioners or people working in sport or in other sport integrity areas like match fixing or safe sport or corruption or what have you, but also with academics, with the critical journalists and a whole lot of other stakeholders, law enforcement, for example, and politicians. So it's great for people bringing ideas together in order to both set the right diagnosis, what needs to be done, and also to try to contribute to even better solutions across sport and across sport integrity. So I think those are really important occasions to tend to. I would say one of the key takeaways is for me also that even though I said that anti-doping is still a relatively young business or a relatively young field, it's come a long way and it's come a bit further than some of the other areas. Some of the other areas are less developed. It would be one of my takeaways from this conference. There's being done a whole lot of good work, but in anti-doping, there's even more developed structures and organizations and methods and disciplines and so on. So I think some of the other areas could be inspired from the anti-doping work, not that it has to be copied, but there could be elements that would be relevant to implement in, for example, working with bullying and harassment or safeguarding, match fixing and so on. That would be some of my observations in hindsight.
Very interesting. Well, we appreciate you sharing those insights. And thus far in our conversation, we've talked a bit about the history of anti-doping in Denmark, as well as how things look now. And I'd love to maybe shift towards the future. So thinking about maybe the next 5 or 10 years, Kim, what are some of the goals that Anti-Doping Denmark is working towards?
We would be very interested in learning from the use of new technology. I think a lot of businesses or fields are looking into this right now. AI, artificial intelligence, would be one of the areas, of course, but making use of technology in different ways. And that would be both in the I&I field, but also in educational efforts, for example. And that could be, and in the testing for that sake. So that could be a whole lot of learnings to do from use of technology. We would be very curious and keen on having an even closer dialogue with athletes, both in qualifying our work, but also in order to pick up important information from the athlete environments and support personnel environments for that sake to qualify and target our work. But of course, also if they have relevant information that could lead to possible cases, because we can perform a whole lot of doping controls, but sometimes we can just perform the right control at the right athlete at the right time with the right test and analysis if we have even better information. So that would be some of the really important avenues to explore, I would say.
Very interesting. And I know oftentimes limited time, resources, staff, whatever the case may be, may prevent the progress that you can make or you'd like to make in anti-doping. So Kim, if we took away the barriers that normally hold you back and you could have anything and do anything, what is the one problem in anti-doping that you would want to solve most?
Big question, Marie. But I would say that one of the big challenges for us in the anti-doping is to get a really good sense of how many athletes do actually dope and how many athletes do actually dope intentionally. So if we could have even better prevalence measures of doping, that would improve our work remarkably and the conditions for the rest of our work. It could show us something about how and where should we target our work. Is there, for example, big differences between sports? Is there big differences between regions or countries? It would also give us a better ground to stand on when discussing the efficiency of our work. So we could see that in light of a new context if we had even better prevalence measures. And most importantly, that could help us improve the efficiency, which would be always an interesting development to hunt.
Absolutely. And I think this is perhaps a unique challenge in anti-doping compared to maybe other types of fields is it's very difficult to understand the scope of the problem, even just because this isn't something that people are going to readily admit to in most cases.
That's exactly right. And it also always makes it an interesting conversation because it's a natural question to ask us, both as a citizen talking to people about our work, as an athlete, for that sake, but also as a politician. They would always want to hear, well, how big is this problem that we're trying to deal with and how should we solve it and so on. So I think it's really important for everybody to be even more precise on this. And research is the best answer to this, I would say.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing so many of your insights and information about Anti-Doping Denmark with us today. But if our listeners want to learn even more, Kim, what is the best way for them to do so?
Well, thank you. It's been my pleasure, Marie, to be part of this conversation. And I would be more than happy to engage if some of the listeners would be more interested to hear about our work or would have follow-up questions or what have you. We have a website, Anti-Doping Denmark's website, antidoping.dk. And also at LinkedIn, my LinkedIn profile, or Anti-Doping Denmark's LinkedIn profile, we try to continually elaborate on our work. So people are always welcome to visit those or to reach out. I would be more than happy to continue the conversation.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Kim. And listeners, definitely check out the Anti-Doping Denmark website. Get connected on LinkedIn. And Kim, it's been such a pleasure to chat. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Marie.
It's been a pleasure, and listeners, always wonderful to have you here with us as well. If you haven't already, please take a moment to follow, rate, or review our podcast on your favorite platform. And listeners, please note that the Anti-Doping Podcast features a wide variety of clean sport experts, and episodes may include statements and or viewpoints that do not necessarily reflect the views or values of the PCC. Thank you, and we look forward to seeing you on the next episode of the Anti-Doping Podcast.